The Emperor of Mankind is a figure from the storylines of the 31st and 41st millenniums, who is shrouded in mystery, half-truths, obscured by a web of deceit, and who seems to have complete confidence in his vision with seemingly no evidence that he should be so confident that he is right. The Emperor prior to the Horus Heresy novels was something of a flat character. He was not a complicated character, and he did not change during the years prior to the Horus Heresy series being published. You could argue he wasn't even flat, he was more one-dimensional and not two. Since the Horus Heresy series began in 2006, however, the Emperor has become a full-fledged, if not fully fleshed out, character in the Black Library literature series. Throughout all of his character development and layers of who he is and what he planned being pulled back and revealed, one question remains from those early years of being a two-dimensional character. Was the Emperor correct when he decided to hide the true nature of the warp and the chaos gods from the Primarchs, from his own gene-sired sons themselves? Today we have myself, Salty John, Adam, and Danny. Danny, let's start with you.
So for me, I think I actually do come down on the Emperor's side here, in that in his grand ambition, which is what I like to call it, right, his vision of how humanity should evolve and eventually kind of rule the galaxy, that the warp is his greatest enemy, right? Like because humanity is becoming a psychic race, right? And that with becoming a psychic race, every new untrained psyker is a gateway to chaos and can be corrupted and create a demonic incursion and all this kind of stuff, is that by suppressing the truth of the warp, by building essentially an atheistic ultra-rationalist, I mean, it's very much a almost satire, I feel like, of this idea of like the ultra-rational materialistic society, that people who do become psychic have been kind of programmed from birth to reject a lot of superstition, to reject the concept of like, the mythological or the magical or the supernatural. And so their psychological defenses against it would be stronger, rather than someone who grew up maybe believing in monsters and demons. And then they're like, oh no, I started having visions or something like that. They would kind of default into these more emotionally based reactions, right? Which is what chaos itself feeds off of, right? Like in all the literature, the warp is always described as the collection of sentient emotion, right? Like every sentient race that has emotions fuels the warp. Enough of those emotions coalesce together and you get Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, etc. And so by having a ultra-rationalist and materialist society, you're cutting down on that kind of emotion. And when people do start, exhibiting psychic potential, they're looking at it from a rational point of view. How do I control this? How do I, what is this phenomenon? I should report I should report to a doctor. I should report to a scholar, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And that allows much more control until eventually humanity is psychically ready to kind of wield the warp in a controlled, I would think of it as a very scientific thing. And the Emperor for me is always a scientist, right? And he's described that way, right? Like in terms of creating the Thunder Warriors and then eventually the Space Marines and the Primarchs and everything else, that he is a scientist. And so for me, I see it as his idea, I think, is inherently correct, that by removing the concepts of the warp, even from his children, who he knows, like Magnus, are, is meant to be a psychic beacon, right? By hiding the warp, he's trying to limit them from going exploring before they're ready to explore, right? And to kind of basically to keep Magnus from doing what he ends up doing, which is going too deep, too far into something he doesn't understand, and then wrecking everything. So for me, I think the Emperor actually was on the right track. I think that was, for his end game, was the best scenario. I just don't think he necessarily went about it the best way. But I think inherently the idea is very strong.
Okay. So the counterpoint to that is going to be presented by Adam. Adam, go ahead.
So my position is that the Emperor probably should have told the Primarchs at the very least what his plan was and what was going on and what to expect, because it's almost the idea of when you tell people not to, it's Pandora's box. Don't open that box. Don't do this. Don't do that. It automatically caused the curiosity to brew in most humans and meta-humans or mega-humans, whatever you call the Primarchs, and they want to know why, or they want to know what's out there. And so and which basically what happened with Magnus is he has this power and these voices are talking to him, or he noticed these things that other people don't notice, especially with his sons. And so it brings out this curiosity, and your dad or your parents don't want to talk about it. So you have to discover it on your own. The other thing is that they've already gone through the warp when they were in the containers, before they were created. So they've already been touched by the warp in a way. And that, I think, also kind of influenced how they were, because the warp and the chaos gods have already had some influence on them, especially where they landed. Now, whether it was planned or not, we don't know. There's speculation on that. But I think that because they landed on certain planets that influenced how they reacted, especially with chaos. The biggest probably example is Lorgar from the Word Bearers, because once he's chastised for worshiping the Emperor, he begins worshiping the chaos gods because that's what they want. And one of his own lieutenants actually told him about the chaos gods. It wasn't the Emperor. This also points to the fact that it seems like most people on average need something to look up to, whether it's a father figure, some sky god, something that we can't see, something like that. And that's why Lorgar turned to worshiping the Emperor at first. But when he's rebuked, he turns to somebody else immediately. So I think that if the Emperor had told his sons maybe just told them his plan, because I don't think he really told them this plan beyond, hey, we're going to conquer the universe. We're going to conquer the galaxy. I need you guys to conquer the galaxy. If he told them why, other than bringing humanity under one umbrella, it may have helped them kind of like form a defense, at least mentally anyway, hopefully. I think some Primarchs were lost causes no matter what, but that's another discussion. But I think that it would have helped them mentally prepare and know what they needed to do, or know how to prepare themselves, as well as prepare humanity for what was to come as the Emperor moved along with his plan.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see both sides of this one. Like, I definitely get what Danny's saying. Like, if the Emperor needs to keep everything under wraps so that the Chaos Gods don't become more powerful, that's the best way to do it, right? Deny their existence. So if you deny their existence, you deny anybody to worship them. And then the amount of power they get would be diminished because there's no direct worshiping. But then there's also, I kind of agree with Adam here, that like by keeping it secret, you're creating the forbidden fruit, right? Like there's a bunch of tropes in here. Like there's a bunch of biblical tropes in here. There's a bunch of different literary tropes in here. There's like psychological tropes in here. The first thing you tell a kid not to do something, they want to do it. And the Primarchs are his sons. So it kind of speaks to what I like about the literature, in that they are able to take these tropes and use them. And like they clearly had to have thought all of this out, because that's a pretty clear one, right? Hey, don't touch the pan, don't touch the hot pan. Okay, are you going to tell me why not to touch the hot pan? Well, I said it was hot. Right, but I don't know what hot means, right? So, like, you have to explain in a way that the kid understands why the thing is bad. Just telling them it's bad doesn't really deter anything. So it makes them kind of want it more. Like, how many kids would just touch a hot pan on a stove if you never told them anything about the pan? Like, if you never acknowledged the pan's existence. You use it all the time. It's in your house. It's there. Cool stuff comes from it, like food, but you don't actually explain what it is. How many kids grab that pan and like seriously hurt themselves because you've never explained to them anything about the pan? That's the warp. Never explained anything about it, but look, I can do all this cool shit with it. Right? I can do all this cool stuff with the warp. All this cool stuff with the warp. I can do everything I want with it. I can read your mind. I can kill things with psychic bullets. Some of you can do it too, sons. But I'm not going to explain it to you. So, like, I get that part of it. But I also get the idea that, like, if you want to diminish the power of the gods, you deny their existence. That's also, like, a common fantasy sci-fi trope, right? That certain things get power from being acknowledged. And by denying them that acknowledgement, you deny them the power. Like the names have power ideas in so much stuff, right? Like speaking the name gives it the power in so many different book series. I feel like that's also something that's a legitimate way to look at it.
Yeah, for me, I think it's I understand about like the comparison of like the hot pan, but going with that of like he does explain some elements of the warp, right? They use it for travel, right? Like some of them do have psychic abilities and they know this. I think denying the true nature of the warp was what was important of like, hey, this thing is like there are these consciousnesses present that will try to prey upon you that I may have made deals with to make you, right? And
maybe not. We'll see.
Yeah. And all of that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a little bit of a difference there. It's not like he denied the warp even existed. He just denied the true nature of it and what's there. And I think part of it too, I mean, as Adam brought up Lorgar, is why the Emperor didn't want to be worshipped. Is because he knew that fueled his power and presence in the warp, and that could be what also pushes him away from his own humanity, right? Like the more power he's been given, the more he's deified, the more he actually does become a deity, and therefore less human, less capable of leading the Imperium in the way he wants to. Because I think, especially if you look at like the stuff about the Emperor in his kind of early reign, that he's, he comes off a lot less kind of brutal as he does towards like the end of the Horus Heresy, right? Where, he is much more of an emotional human creature of like, I don't want to just slaughter innocents. Yes, people have to die, but it's for the greater cause. It's to protect humanity. And then by the end of the Horus Heresy, I mean, he's just almost robotic, right? Like, and I think part of that too is because again, that there is this growing, this kind of growing imprint in the warp of himself, of people seeing him as a deity and people putting this faith in him. And then, finally, we see by the kind of end, by the where we are in the 41st millennium, right, that like he essentially is a chaos god, or he's a warp entity, right? Like he has his own demons, he has his own powers and can influence and give power to mortals, right? So I think the long plan, the long game, I think was the correct. He probably could have done it better of how he explained things, especially to like the ones who are psychic, right? Of kind of, giving them a little more training. But the way I think of it instead of the hot pan is that he's, it's like if you have a weapon in your house and your child sees it, right? You can't just ignore it. And I don't think he ignores it, but you can't also tell them exactly what it is, what it does, how it works, because that will also make them curious about, look, well, I want to see how it really works, right? I want to see what it can really do. As much as just saying like, well, don't touch that will fuel that. That's human reticence bias, right? That's natural. But if you really explain it, that also too opens the door to that curiosity of, well, I really want to see what it's going to do. And I think, even if he had took Magnus aside and been like, look, man, you're almost my equal psychically, right? Like, here's all this, here's the download. I think Magnus would have jumped into things even more so, and probably even more recklessly, because he'd be like, oh, I understand this. I'm fine. I got it. I can do this. Right. I can make deals.
I can do it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think he had that attitude regardless of how much he knew from, that to me, that brings up,
you're right.
Yeah. So to me, that brings up like I mentioned before, the Pandora's box, where they have the Council on Achaia, and it seemed like him and some of the Primarchs. So at that point, everybody knows what's going on with the warp. Everybody has an idea of the Emperor's plan, but maybe not what he really wanted to do. And then they do have this council where it seems like they're trying to put everything back in the box. Because they decide, you know what, we're not going to use Psychers at all. Nobody's allowed to use Psychers except for Space Wolves. But I don't
psychic powers,
know.
weather magic.
But I'm wondering. To me, that's part. The council is also part of the question of, was it right for him to do this with his sons? Because it seems he still felt like that was the right thing to do, or it's the right course, because he tries to put the genie back in the bottle with the Council of Nicaea, where he tells everybody, all right, okay, yeah, there's the warp. It's like the fireworks scene from Police Squad. There's nothing to see here. Move along. Put put your psychers on ice. Don't use psychic powers. Try as hard as you can not to use those psychic powers. And by doing that, I think it caused even more curiosity as to why can't we use them? They seem to be helping because they notice how well it works against these creatures that they've never seen before, never interacted before. Before. So
these aliens that clearly aren't aliens, but we have to keep saying are Xenos. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a salient point. One I'm willing to concede of, like, once the common knowledge was out there, I think like the Emperor screwed up by being like, nope. Like, so I think the metaphor of Pandora's Box's app of like, no, once it's open, you've got to kind of honestly deal with it. And I think that's where, Big E really kind of made a mistake is, he really should have tried to educate the Primarchs and the legions about what are you really facing. I didn't want you to know this has got its own problems, but this is way better and a much better choice than just being like, let's pretend this didn't happen and everything's going to be fine. Right. Yeah. So I do think that once the secret was out, I do think he definitely needed to kind of change tack about like, how do I mitigate this damage rather than just try to stick to what I'd originally planned. Right. Yeah. It actually reminds me of the old fantasy lore for the Lizardmen of like the old ones who create this, really complex mathematical plan to kind of control creation. And once they die out in the great catastrophe, the Lizardmen are responsible for trying to keep that plan going and, and never deviating from it. And like, of course, the big, the big irony of it is like, well, no, the plan's already broken. You can't fix it, right? You should be trying to come up with a new plan that accepts the old plan isn't going to work. You're not going to get exactly what you wanted, but what can you best possibly get out of the scenario, salvage out of it, as opposed to just try to create a flawed version of the original plan because it just won't work anymore. So there's a kind of nice almost synchronicity between the old Warhammer fluff and the 40K fluff in that sense of the Emperor being like, fuck, my plan didn't work. Well, I'm going to pretend like it did, and we're just going to try and pretend like everything's going to be okay.
Yeah. Well, and I also think this is another example of the Emperor is not really human, and so he can't actually be a father. Because a father would have handled each of the sons separately, not at some giant council. Right? Like Lorgar, rather than like censuring Lorgar in front of another brother and like using that brother to do it, right?
Yeah. Right.
He would have handled it on his own, maybe with the custodes, right? Or whatever.
Right.
And explained why without forcing his entire, legion to kneel using his own psychic powers that the guy's trying to worship, right? Like, it would have been handled differently. But again, that's like, he's not an actual dad. These aren't his real sons, not really. And they're like full-fledged adults when he finds them. And so they were raised by other people already. And like, there's all these various layers of mess-ups that would have been avoided if it were like a quote-unquote normal family. Right? Or could have been handled better. Like, why does the favorite son still get to have his weather psychers? and why was it totally cool that your number one psychic son just skipped out on the meeting altogether? So, like, he would have handled Magnus on his own, and he could have handled Lorgar separately, and Mortarion separately, and understood the like, hey, I totally screwed up my son, Mortarion,
Angron,
and Angron. By rescuing them without rescuing them, by rescuing them at the totally wrong moment, but he's not. He's a flawed character. And I think a lot of, what'd you say? I think a lot of people are still stuck in that two-dimensional character I talked about in the intro, where the Emperor's right and the Emperor's vision was right. And so everything he decides is correct, and everybody else just messes it up. Right? That's why the Magnus did nothing wrong is so funny. Right? Magnus did nothing wrong. Well, really, the Emperor did a lot wrong. But I think a lot of people get stuck in the idea that, like, well, he's the Emperor, and because he's so godlike in the storyline, you can't actually hold him to a human standard, which is, I don't think, entirely true.
Well, what I was going to say is that in regards to some of the older fluff pre the Horus Heresy, I mean, the Emperor did have like biological sons back in the old, first and second edition. But even then, he didn't really care for them. He was like a deadbeat dad, so to speak.
Shocking. Those are the. I'm sorry. Those are the. Those were the.
They were psychic blanks. They were the.
The pariahs.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, I thought it was like the John Grammaticus guys.
No.
That's what.
No, it wasn't. They weren't called perpetuals. They were called something else. And he had a bunch of sons because they were. There was a theory that they would band together, sacrifice themselves, and have the emperor be reborn as a new god, basically.
Isn't that the sensei?
It's the sensei. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think
because they were all psychic blanks.
Mm-hmm. I think it's something that's interesting. Is I'm sure there'll be an episode of specifically talking about the emperor's parenting choices.
Yes.
But I mean, I think it's interesting that they did kind of introduce, I think, a little bit more. I don't remember her until pretty recently of Erda,
Mm-hmm.
right, which is essentially the Primarch's mother.
Yeah.
The woman who kind of guides them, and is known isn't she, I think, also a perpetual? So she's known the emperor for a very, very long time.
If not perpetual, she's just super duper old. Yeah, one of the two.
Yeah. Yeah. But, it's interesting that they did kind of bring in a character kind of designed to, they can't really retcon all the things the emperor's done as a father figure. But I think, going through that idea of the emperor as this character who has this great plan, which again, for me, I think the plan is correct. I think his kind of grand vision, I think, comes from, is a good one. It's just his actual implementation of it fails, especially once the plan kind of goes off the skids, right? Like once it's off the rails, he really, really can't adapt well to that. And that's where we get a whole host of problems. But even, that it's just the plan may have been good, but how he dealt with his own Primarchs, like outside of just not telling them about the true nature of the warp, but literally how he raised them or really integrated them, into his life when he found them. Like he just made so many mistakes that something bad was going to happen. Right. And he just really couldn't necessarily see that. Right. That, what was, basically his own actions really pushed things forward and were created the ground for the problem to be there. And I just, like I said, I'm kind of on his side about his idea of how to win as the human race, right? Like how mankind wins in the grand scheme of things, but he just actually didn't execute his plan well. And that's because, he sees himself as human when he's really not, and doesn't totally listen to the human people around him, and doesn't even admit that he lacks certain human insights after existing for, 60,000 years or however long he's more or less existed.
Yeah, I almost think the plan was flawed from the beginning, especially since whether by design or by accident, that the Primarchs were sent through the warp as babies, essentially. I think from that point on, the plan of don't tell them what's in the warp or what the warp is, it was out the window, because they've all been touched in some way or another.
I don't know. The guy with the wings seems totally normal and not touched by chaos at all.
And the guy with one eye.
Yeah, right.
The giant red one-eyed guy.
Red one-eyed guy.
What? It's totally cool that I can make myself bigger and smaller, right? As fits my whim. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's totally normal things for totally normal people.
Yeah. Yeah. So, did anybody's opinions shift?
No.
I mean, I'm definitely, I think I'm a little more on the nuanced approach of, I still think in the grand scheme of things, like in the big picture, yeah, he had a good idea about how to do it. I just think he could not see that the plan was going to stop working very quickly, especially once the Primarchs are scattered. And once he started screwing them up, once he started making these really bad parenting decisions, right? Like if he had any if he had an understanding of how to be a parent, or of even just how to be a teacher, and and it kind of interact with people on a human level, he would have been like, ooh, well, I was relying on these individuals being kind of equally rational as I am, right? And seeing the world as I am. And that's not who or what they are, because they're not me. And so I need to adapt what I'm going to do here based around these individuals who I have who are not me. And I think that might be part of it. He really did assume. I feel like he assumed they would all think the way he does, and they don't, right? Like, because they were all raised in different environments, and they're all different aspects of who he is. It's the kind of the same thing of like the parent who's just like, you must be into everything I am, and you must be exactly like me, rather than being like, nope, sorry, you have a theater kid. You might have to roll with that.
Yeah, I wonder if, like what Adam was saying was true, that as soon as the Primarchs get scattered by chaos and they're in their little capsules, if game was up. Like at that point, you had to throw out your playbook and not do what the lizard men were doing, like Danny says, and just following the formula, right? Like at that point, do you need to literally throw the playbook out and start over, instead of being like, oh, hey, look, I found this one. Oh, hey, look, I found this one. I'm just going to bring you into the fold and assume it's all going to work out okay if I just keep going. I just, it's a weird one for me, because in a way he probably was right in trying to keep it a secret, but in another way you can't keep a secret like that. Like that's not really the way you can deal with it. Not fully. Anyways. All right. Does anybody else have a final word they want to put in?
Stay tuned for eventually we'll do an episode about Big E's greatest hits as a dad.
We should get a book, like a parenting book, and go through it like chapter by chapter and talk about all the mistakes Big E makes on the chapter.
I'm afraid that's going to hit too close for home for all of us.
It'll end up with everybody on the show crying.
I'm supposed to feed my kid? What?
Yeah.
3 meals.
Default to Bender. God. It's like, you kids, it's like every other day I need to feed you.
Yes.
Oh, I feel like that's a good a good example of what the Emperor would have been like as a true father.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What do you mean I got to feed these kids? Mal could already take care of it.
Yeah, that's basically what it is.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more episodes of Pod Save the Imperium, where we discuss all kinds of different aspects of the fluff. And next time, we're going to talk about whether or not Abaddon was any good at his job.